right, welcome to today's episode of Monsterology, and today we're going to talk about the meaning of giants. Giants are very ancient and seem to be in every culture, and there's probably an episode that I can devote to many different giants, and giants in particular. I want to introduce the idea and what the meaning of giants are here, and talk about a couple of specific cases like giants of the Bible, the Nephilim, Nimrod, and then also a little bit about Attack on Titan, which is an extremely popular Japanese manga and anime series. I think many people are watching it, many people have read it. I think it's one of the most influential and best-selling manga series and anime series. So let me just back up a little bit to the origin of the word giant. It basically comes from the Greek word which means earthborn. If you were to sort of look at the Parthenon in Athens, you would find there a frieze of sculptures, and it would have included images of the gigantomachia. And the gigantomachia just means the war of the giants. Now, most of this sculpture was actually ripped down by the Christians in the 7th century, and sort of stripping away the sort of what they saw as the heathen and pagan traditions. Some of this frieze sculpture ended up at the British Museum and in other places, so you can still see some of it. There's wonderful images of giants which have snakes for legs, battling, Olympians and heroes like Heracles or Hercules. But basically the story of their origin is a little bit confused, not just for moderns, but it's confused even in the ancient world. Originally, they're born of Gaia. Gaia is Mother Earth, that's the goddess of all living things, who mated with her own son, Uranus, which is the sky god, and they produced the Titans. Now, Uranus hated the Titans and was disgusted by them and blocked them up inside Gaia, preventing them from coming out. Gaia got her revenge by giving a sickle or a knife to her son Kronos inside her, and when Uranus came back to mate with her again, to lie with her, he was summarily castrated by the son, the Titan Kronos. Then the drops of blood that came from this wound actually then entered into Gaia, and these basically created the race of giants. The giants then are oftentimes confused with the Titans, but they're not the same. Eventually they come out and fight it's actually as soon as they're born, they start fighting. And the war of the sort of giants and the gods, again, is represented in a lot of ancient Greek and Roman art. So that's sort of the origin of giants generally, but what I want to do today is show you some specific giants of the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, and then pause a little bit on the Japanese one. Okay, good. So as usual, I've done two images. This is the first one, which is from Dante's Inferno, and this is Nimrod, the giant. And then this is from Attack on Titan, which is this contemporary Japanese anime. So I'm going to show you how I made both these images and then try to explain a little bit about, what do they mean. And what you're looking at here is a technique I'm using, which is super simple. It's just a ballpoint pen. And you can see that the way to get a sort of a refined, feathery sort of shading is you have to use the ballpoint pen unidirectionally. You have to sort of sweep it in one direction rather than going back and forth. I sort of learned this the hard way by screwing it up over and over again. I'm by no means a master of this technique. I'm really just learning. But it's surprising to take such a humble writing implement and turn it into something that can create such fine sort of shading. This is basically, you see me drawing kind of reference to a great painting by Peter Bruegel from 1563, which is basically a painting of the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel was essentially created by Nimrod. And Nimrod is considered to be, in some traditions, a giant who wanted to create a tower that would reach up to heaven. And when God saw this, basically he destroyed the tower, and he basically gave all the human beings different languages and spread them across the planet so that they would not be able to coalesce into such a strong force again. And basically this is an explanation for why we have different human languages. And here I have, since Dante refers to Nimrod in this level of hell, sort of entrapped within the Tower of Babel, I've sort of drawn him screaming, trapped with two other giants. This is a very low level of Dante's Inferno, sort of just before they meet Satan. And it was just sort of fun to try to represent Bruegel's wonderful Tower of Babel together with this image of Nimrod. Nimrod is a symbol then of pride, and you're going to see that really that's what the giant means primarily in all these different traditions, whether it's the pagan tradition or the Judeo-Christian tradition. Giants generally symbolize pride. It's interesting that if you look at the Bible, there's a reference to giants in Genesis, and that becomes sort of the original text that sort of explains where they came from, but it's contentious. In chapter 6 of Genesis, it says, quote, "And after that," well, here the "that" is referring to the fact that Noah became a father. So after Noah became a father, quote, "men began to be multiplied upon the earth, and daughters were born to them. And sons of God, seeing the daughters of men, that they were fair, took to themselves wives of all which they chose. Now giants were upon the earth in those days, for after the sons of God went into the daughters of men, and they brought forth children, these are the mighty men of old, men of renown." End quote. And that passage, together with a couple of other, like a passage in Samuel and in the book of Numbers, that sort of accounts for the popular theory that giants roamed the earth prior to the flood, and that these would have been wiped out, during the deluge. The mainstream interpretation of this is, laid down by St. Jerome and by St. Augustine, and they interpreted the sons of God in that reference to be the offspring of Seth. Then you recall that Seth is Adam and Eve's other son besides Cain and Abel. And then the daughters of men referred to there are thought to be the children of Cain. But there was this radically different interpretation developed in the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch suggested that the sons of God here should be read as angels who fall from grace because they have sex with beautiful human women. That's the daughters of men in this tradition. So in chapter 7 of the book of Enoch, it says, "And when the angels, these sons of heaven, beheld them, they became enamored of them, saying to each other, 'Come, let us select for ourselves wives from the progeny of men, and let us beget children.' When these fallen angels, called Gregory or Watchers, mated with mortal women, then their offspring were the giants, and those were called nephilim, which is from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. The Gregory angels were punished for leaving their rightful place and cavorting with human women, and the giants were then destroyed by the flood. In fact, the tradition that sort of comes out of the book of Enoch suggests that it's the destruction of these giants, not man's sinfulness, that really explains God's true motive for the flood. So in chapter 7 of Enoch, he says there's a kind of war that's broken out between the giants and the humans. And the giants had, quote, "consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood." End quote. So finally, the archangels went to God and asked him to resolve this, and that's basically why you get Noah's flood, according to this tradition. But the giants were sort of a wily breed, and they crop up from time to time in the post-Diluvian episodes. The Venerable Bede of the 7th century, who was a Benedictine monk, said, quote, "It calls giants men," this is a sort of a passage in Genesis, "who were born with huge bodies endowed with excessive power, such as even after the flood we read that there were many in the time of Moses or David," end quote. And this is where the Nimrod legend comes from. Nimrod is the grandson of Ham, and he's the instigator of the Tower of Babel, and basically he's punished as a kind of symbol of pride. And now, if we're back to the drawing, what I've done here is I've started to draw this image from Attack on Titan. And I think Attack on Titan is just a wonderful contemporary giant story. The creator of Attack on Titan is a manga writer and illustrator, Hajime Isayama. And Isayama has suggested quite recently that he hopes that the giants come back into popular culture and start to dominate in the way that maybe zombies have dominated for the last decade or so. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but in any case, he's doing his best to sort of bring back the giants. This is a drawing I'm doing of the colossal giant. Fans of the show will know this kind of stuff. It's not that important for this sort of discussion of the meaning of monsters per se, but the storyline of Attack on Titan is basically there's a kind of mysterious world time frame in which humans inhabit this sort of walled-in territory, and they're surrounded by human-eating giants, and they have to sort of battle against these and, you know, try to survive and dominate. The technique I'm using here is I laid down just a simple line drawing with pencil, and now I'm using a Japanese ink. In this case, it's a brown or a sepia color. And I'm just going over the drawing and trying to get a really clean line. I've put this blue tape down just to sort of protect once I roll over this with watercolors. And so what I'm doing here is coming in with watercolors and liquid ink. And I'm going to paint down the colors. I'm not really being too careful here, because you'll see I'm going to come over this with a roller and some acrylic paint and then work back into it. But I do want to just get the basic colors down before I come back at it. So some of the themes that come up again in the Attack on Titan series are similar to these ancient stories that would have been told by the pagans, the Romans, the Greeks, by the monotheists like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, namely pride. And so you see in the Japanese story there's a whole theme of the pride of war, trying to dominate, sort of a thirst for political domination is sort of a theme in the series, and these giants are being used in a sense by humans who are trying to manipulate and dominate other humans. But belief in, giants was not just symbolic or, a sort of a moral message. It was oftentimes believed that they were real and that they existed out there in nature. This was very much true during the late medieval period and the early Renaissance. So, for example, the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which were published in the 14th century, they refer to all kinds of creatures out there that the supposed John Mandeville ran into in the East, and this would have included strange races of cyclops and winged creatures that we've never seen before in Europe, but also lots of references to giants. And the belief there was that giants were out there in the world in these hidden sort of faraway places. It was a kind of early cryptozoology, really. And it's interesting that Caesar Augustus, having been shown the bones of dinosaurs without having any knowledge of what a dinosaur was back then in the ancient world, thought that they were in fact the bones of giants, giant men. And so that belief was a kind of a literal expectation. In fact, Christopher Columbus was who was familiar with the sort of stories from Mandeville's tales, was surprised not to find some of these creatures, including giants, when he arrived in the Americas. He fully expected to find this sort of thing. So, all right, let me just show you back to the drawing for a moment here. What I've done is I've added the color, and now I'm using a roller with acrylic paint and a matte medium, and I'm going to roll over this painting, and then if you let it dry, it creates this wonderful kind of toothy substrate that you can go back into with colored pencils. So that's what you see me doing here. And this is always a dangerous move. If you've seen some of my other videos, you have seen me screw this up. It must be the hubris, pride, perhaps. In any case, it's worth mentioning then that there's this common theme in monsterology where the monster, particularly in this case the giant, is kind of a humanist. You know, if you see the Christian view of giants is that they're acting with pride and hubris, and now they're going to be laid low by divine justice. And it's true that even the heroes of the ancient pagan world, people like Hercules, who was thought to be a giant in a sense, they were later demonized by the Christian tradition because they were thought to be themselves just trying to make it on their own as existential heroes in the world without the help of Yahweh. And so they get punished in many of the retellings of the medieval period. There's a 10th century, very famous Alfric's 10th century collection called The Lives of the Saints. And in The Lives of the Saints, the writer says, quote, "What holiness was in that hateful Hercules, the huge giant who slaughtered all his neighbors and burned himself alive in the fire after he had killed men and the lion and the great serpent," end quote. These people get basically knocked down and are taught, in a sense, the moral lesson to supplicate yourself to some higher power, in this case the divine monotheistic God. But I love this imagery in the Attack on Titan material because it's so uncanny. The creatures are truly uncanny in that sense that Freud describes. They are human-like, so they're humanoid, but also they're missing their genitalia. In this case, the guy's missing his skin. They have way more teeth than they're supposed to have, and they're just nightmarish. So I think it's really sort of activating that uncanny quality. Okay, so this is the final image. I hope you enjoyed this little tour of giants in the Western and in the Japanese world. And please hit the subscribe button and come back for more. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.